All right, I think we're ready to go. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining our, I think, fourth now press box event. We've been trying to do these every month or so after city council meetings, at least, and maybe add a couple in here and there just to talk about what went down yesterday, talk about any new issues that came up, things that we're going to be talking about over the next month, or I guess now month and a half, now that this is a big one. We're now heading into this long August recess, and so we're going to be talking about the issues that are going to be simmering over the next month and a half before budget season, which is the next big thing. I'm Alex Nitkin, editor and City Hall reporter at the Daily Line. Here is Erin Hegarty, my partner in crime, also reporter, City Hall reporter at the Daily Line. Heather Cherone is, I'm just, Heather Cherone of WTTW, the Daily Line alumna extraordinaire. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to have you back.
Happy to be back.
Talk about some of this stuff. So let's plunge right into this. Can everyone see our PowerPoint here? Okay, so here's the basic agenda of what we want to talk about today. And before we get started, I want to point out there is a conversation chat box in the side. We really want to encourage everyone to ask questions over the course of this, and then we'll make sure that we leave time at the end to come back and make sure that those are addressed. Today, we're going to spend a good chunk of time first talking about, I think, the big high-profile banner issue, many years in the making, that finally culminated yesterday, the passage of an ordinance creating a civilian oversight commission of the Chicago Police Department. We are going to be talking about the expedited sign permit ordinance that passed after a delay. We have a new mega development in the pipeline, Bronzeville Lakefront, aka Michael Reese. We're going to talk about a sort of scuffle between a city watchdog and the city council and mayor over the hiring of ward superintendents that handle trash pickup and that kind of thing. We're going to talk about other, all kinds of new legislation that came up, and then look forward a little bit to the fall. So let's get started with civilian police oversight. So when last we left at this event last month, we were talking about what happened in the June council meeting. Essentially, it seemed like at that public safety meeting last month, right, there was a last minute compromise, but it just did not have enough support to get over the hill. So I guess I want to start going back to that. What has happened, Erin, since then, since that sort of last, falter that the ordinance took?
Mm-hmm. Well, that last minute change last month was to take out a part of the ordinance from the Empowering Communities for Public Safety Coalition. That was a huge kind of sticking point for many aldermen, and that was a referendum that would have given, it would have kind of, I don't know, it was, aldermen had said that they would be for this ordinance if it wasn't for that referendum. So
it was a referendum that would let people essentially choose whether they want to go. It was GAPA with a referendum asking people if they want to make it CPAC, which is the sort of more radical version of it, right?
Correct. And so since then, and actually more so just in the past week or less than a week, members of the ECPS coalition and people from Mayor Lori Lightfoot's office started negotiating, and they kind of over the weekend cranked out a last minute compromise ordinance for civilian oversight of the Chicago Police Department. And I don't know, that's what was passed yesterday with the 36-13 vote. And one of the huge points of contention was who got the final say over policy for the police department. And basically, it seems like both parties are happy, perhaps, with this compromise, and that the citywide 7-member commission can basically vote on policy for the police department. However, the mayor has veto power over that policy. But still, just like any other piece of legislation in the city council with a 2/3 vote can override the mayor's veto. So the mayor has final say, but the city council can override her decision.
Right. So this was the critical question at the center of this that has delayed this for so long, right? Is who would get the ultimate final authority to be able to make a policy decision. This is something that we had, if you read our story from earlier in the week, we were able to unearth some hacked emails to sort of spell out a timeline of how exactly this happened. Last March, the last time this almost came to a vote, the mayor's staff said, the mayor is going to have final authority. The GAPA basically stood firm and said, this is a really foundational principle that we're not going to budge on. So Heather, I guess I'm curious, why do you think they budged on it? Or do you think that this is a concession for them? And if so, I guess I'm curious why they would still be comfortable moving forward with it, even if there is still that provision that the mayor can veto.
Well, I think a couple of things happened. One, I think we can't underestimate the impact that the deaths of 13-year-old Adam Toledo and 22-year-old Anthony Alvarez had after police shootings. They were two people killed after foot chases, and there was a lot of attention on the fact that there should have been a foot pursuit policy in place for the Chicago Police Department, and there was not. And that is really at the heart of what this panel was designed to do, to avoid sort of having areas without policy, without rules for police officers to follow, because there's such a high chance of death and tragedy happening from those. So I think that gave sort of the coalition behind the ECPS coalition sort of reason to sort of get together and start negotiations between the two of them, because originally there was a GAPA ordinance and there was a CPAC ordinance, and they both were similar in some ways and different in others. And then sort of, I think, what sort of made it clear that they were going to sort of have to come together was the fact that the mayor's proposal really only drew nominal support from aldermen. Her proposal would have given this panel just advisory power. Like, essentially they could have recommended things to the mayor or the city council, but they would really had no authority. And I think that was a non-starter with the majority of aldermen. So that really, I think, signaled to the mayor that wasn't going to go anywhere, so that she needed to negotiate as best she could with the community coalitions. And that's why the crucial compromise really was giving the panel authority over policy, but also allowing the mayor to veto it. I'm really interested to see how this will work in practice, because it is, been a more than a decade since the city council has vetoed anything by the city by the mayor. So I will be interested to see whether that happens and sort of how that plays out. But I think that the deaths of Adam Toledo and Anthony Alvarez after, sort of the death of George Floyd, the murder, I should say, of George Floyd, as well as all of the protests, really made it clear that the mayor was under a significant amount of pressure to get this done, and that an advisory panel that she envisioned was just not going to pass. So this was the best compromise that she could get through the city council.
Yeah, it's interesting. It went from being advisory to her still having veto power, but now there's this sort of system of channels that she has to go through if she wants to do that, right? She has to explain in writing why she's vetoing it. She has to put it through the city council process. And you make a good point that it's really hard. We talk about how sometimes it can be a struggle for the mayor to get to 26 votes on something. You'd have to believe it wouldn't be that hard for her to get to, 17 votes, which is all it would take to avoid an override. I was really struck by something that Alderman Rod Sawyer said yesterday, one of the main sponsors of the original GAPA ordinance and now sponsor of ECPS. He said that, well, the mayor can veto something, but then it falls back upon the community groups and the sort of grassroots ECPS coalition. Their obligation is then to come to us as aldermen and sort of rise up with the voice of the people and say, you have to override it now. Again, easier said than done. But yesterday, I think this was probably the longest, most time consuming, and obviously most, impassioned and charged section of the meeting. We heard a lot of different speeches, reflections, arguments from aldermen. especially when there is a really close vote, you're sort of wondering if any of these are actually like influencing people. You'd have to think before that they would have it in, the whip counters in the mayor's office already knew that it was going to go through, but still it only passed by 2 votes. What I'm curious to hear from each of you, you were both in the chambers, which aldermen's speeches, remarks really stuck out to you? Some got pretty personal. Did you sort of learn anything new about their own stances or backgrounds? And starting with you, Erin.
So 2 that stuck out to me, which there's way more than 2, but I'll stick to that. One was Alderman Jason Irvin. He kind of had a call to his colleagues to think outside of their own wards, their own communities, about what could, help the city as a whole, where, maybe on the north side, this isn't, in some north side neighborhoods, this might not be, residents might not be calling for police reform. But he encouraged aldermen to think outside of their own silos, as he said, because he said he didn't want, kids in his ward, their first interaction with the police shouldn't be on the hood of the car. It should be in a community setting. And I mean, this is community or civilian oversight of the police. That's exactly what this is trying to do. And also, this was just like a pretty good quote, I thought. Alderman Raymond Lopez, when he said, there were some, arguments that this ordinance would, cause people to be hesitant about applying to become a police officer. And what he said was accountability is not a loss. And it's, not the end of policing. And I don't know, I thought it was interesting, especially because, I don't know, he's a pretty pro-police, he's supportive of the police, and he's also not supportive of the mayor. So I was interested to see, what he said yesterday. I mean, this is kind of, his comments yesterday echoed what he said during the public safety meeting on Tuesday. But yeah, that this kind of restores legitimacy in law enforcement. Those are 2 that stuck out to me.
Yeah, it is always sort of a twist when Raymond Lopez comes out in favor of the mayor's policies, especially on something that is as narrow a vote as this. Another thing that really stuck out to me that he said, this might have been during the committee meeting, was we heard a lot of police groups really revolting against the idea of using body cameras. And now police love body cameras because they are helping them, tell their own side of the story as well. And he said that this could be another example of that. If they now have some more legitimacy behind what they're doing, they would have a firmer, leg to stand on when they face critics. Before we move on, Heather, of all of the speechifying question and answers from the mayor, from the city council meeting, were there any moments that really stuck out to you or felt like we learned something about anyone who's involved here?
Well, so I thought it was interesting that one alderman who voted against the proposal in the committee meeting Tuesday evening switched his vote and then voted for it. And that was Alderman Derek Curtis of the 18th Ward. And we didn't really get to hear why he did that, which I would love to know. But, I have been low-key fascinated with the role of Alderman Chris Taliaferro in this. He is chair of the Public Safety Committee. He was put there by Mayor Lori Lightfoot to replace Alderman Ariel Roboiras, who was one of 2 Latino aldermen to vote against this proposal yesterday. And his remarks were fascinating because, of course, he had spent 16 months blocking a vote on the proposal from GAPA and giving the mayor time to put something together. And then he got up and he delivered a really impassioned speech that drew on his background as a member of the United States Marine Corps and also a former police sergeant who worked in the Internal Affairs Division. And he likened the city's policing apparatus to his leaky basement, which he said takes on water. And he says that, every so often he's got to pull out carpet and take down drywall. And he said, look, it's not the city's fault that I keep having to do that. It's because I have cracks in my foundation and we have to fix the cracks in the city's foundations. And for somebody who's really has been seen as sort of an impediment to this reform, that I think firmly encapsulates the position of all of the reform groups who were in favor of this. So that definitely struck me. And I think it's clear that had Mayor Lightfoot not put him in charge of the Public Safety Committee in place of Ariel Roboiris, I don't know that this would have passed. I don't think we would have had this vote. And I think that complicates sort of the mayor's role in all of this, because of course she campaigned in favor of the GAP proposal, but then she dropped her support of it, and then she came up with a much less authoritative version of it. But so it's complicated. You know, she said last night after the city council meeting that this was really a fulfillment of her campaign promise. And I think that's true to some extent, but it's a complicated issue that I think is not easily told.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about the role of Taliaferro, and it's hard to imagine how it would have been different with, or it's interesting to imagine how it would have been different with Roboiris. You know, yesterday everyone was mutually praising and laudatory and thanking everyone else for their leadership. A lot of us noticed, I think, when Leslie Hairston, original CPAC sponsor, said, Chairman Taliaferro has mostly been a good leader. I think that we have to keep in mind that she and a lot of other aldermen have been super critical of him for, like you said, Heather, holding this up, waiting until the mayor was ready this entire time. And there's just been a lot of frustration about, you know, Erin has written about the number of meetings that he's sort of abruptly canceled at the last minute. And we've seen a lot of aldermen getting really antsy that they want the Public Safety Committee to be more active. But this is certainly a big win for him. So now we're looking forward to, I guess, elections in 2022 for the next district area councils that are going to be nominating the members of the commission. Until then, we're going to have an interim commission that is nominated by the Rules Committee. In other words, just the city council itself, which is, you know, a committee of the whole. And Lightfoot is going to choose that. So that is going to be the next thing we're watching there. But obviously a big moment for police reform yesterday. So this did not, moving on to sign permits, take up as much space or as much oxygen, but this is a huge, you know, long simmering issue between the mayor and the city council. It has really direct implications for this ongoing sort of dance over aldermanic prerogative, which is something that we're really interested in at the Daily Line and like to keep really close track of. Erin, could you just give us sort of a reminder of what public way use permits are, first of all, and sort of what the mayor was trying to do here in the first place with them?
Yeah, so if there's a sign that is going to be, for example, if there's a sign that's going to be in the public way, you have to submit and you're a business, you have to submit an application, and it goes through this long process, and ultimately it ends up in a city council committee. And I don't know, I'm not an alderman, but I would assume that aldermen don't read each and every public way use application, and they approve these applications pretty much within a few minutes.
It's a 12-page agenda passed in 3 minutes every single month.
And the meeting is done. So, but you know, the mayor said yesterday she can't believe it's taken this long, and you know, she hears businesses complaining that they have to wait months and months for these sign permits, and other cities have expedited this process, but aldermen want to be able to, like you said, have control over these permits. So the past proposal from Mayor Lightfoot kind of stripped aldermen of that power, and last month Alderman Brendan Riley of the 42nd Ward made a motion to take this little piece of, or not little piece, but this section of Mayor Lightfoot's bigger Shy-Bish strong post-pandemic recovery package, and he wanted a separate vote on it because it's so critical to aldermen.
Right. So originally it would have allowed the Business Affairs and Consumer Protection Department to ultimately, at the end of the day, unilaterally approve one of these public way use permits. It would get a recommendation from the alderman. And she kept saying, you know, obviously we will value aldermen's input. And it was very hard for her to imagine why a situation in which an alderman says we don't want this approved and the BACP would overrule them. Heather, why was that not enough to satisfy Brendan Riley, to satisfy the 24 aldermen who wanted to strip this out?
Well, because aldermen worry that this was the start of a slippery slope where the real sort of power was going to shift from the city council to the appointed department heads. And, Lightfoot and both outgoing commissioner of BACP, Rosa Escareno, was like, look, we promise we're not going to jam you up. We're not going to approve a sign permit that you don't like. But that just simply wasn't enough, because aldermen live in fear of something going up in their ward becoming either an eyesore or a nuisance, and them sort of having to pay the piper on election day. Because Chicago, the cliche is true. It's a city of neighborhoods. And if you have something in your ward that reduces your quality of life, you're going to hold the alderman accountable, not the unelected head of the Business Affairs and Consumer Protection Department. The problem with this is that Mayor Lori Lightfoot ran for office in 2019, promising to end that sort of control, which we all call aldermanic prerogative, because it has been abused repeatedly, and she said was necessary to end to root out corruption. But like most things that Mayor Lightfoot has encountered in the past 2 years, that was easier said than done, because aldermen are completely unwilling to even consider the slightest reduction in their power. So that's where this animosity came from, and that's why it was rejected in June, and that's why the mayor had no choice but to sort of reach this compromise agreement that sailed through the city council late yesterday. And I think that it's pretty clear that any future attempts to sort of scale back aldermanic prerogative are going to be met with sort of a wall of opposition. And I'm not even, and even though the mayor keeps saying that she, is fully in favor still of ending aldermanic prerogative and changing the zoning code, I think we're going to talk a little bit about the fight over the ward superintendent role. And I think her comments there signal that she knows that this is a battle she will lose and one she can't really afford to wage.
Yeah, it's interesting that when she originally proposed this and was asked about this element of the Chavez Strong, bigger 90-page business relief package, she really de-emphasized the aldermanic prerogative part of it. She says, this is all about just making it faster for businesses, and that's what I care about. And that ended up manifesting in what we saw yesterday, that it will still make it faster for businesses, but keep aldermen in the driver's seat of that. I think it is important to remember, though, some of the arguments that, if not the mayor made, we heard people like Michelle Smith make in favor of keeping that provision as the mayor proposed it. Michelle Smith, the chair of the Ethics and Government Oversight Committee, saying we have to remember we have many examples in recent history of aldermen abusing this authority that they have, in one-off situations to hold up any specific permit that they have or that they want to be rejected. To back up on the process of this a little bit, it was, like Erin said, it was sort of stripped out of the rest of the ordinance, then promptly Raymond Lopez and Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez deferred and published it. Meeting was kicked to the next meeting. We had this sort of back and forth where Emma Mitz, the chair of the license committee, then invoked what's called Rule 41 to try to get it back on the city council meeting agenda anyway. But then sort of at the last minute, we heard about this compromise as it was billed between the mayor and Brendan Riley to essentially BACP would have the power to grant the permits, but only if they have a positive recommendation from the alderman. And there's this sort of back channel way around that, which is that if the applicant wants to, or if BACP disagrees with the alderman's rejection, the applicant can file their own ordinance to overrule the alderman. So good luck with that, I guess, getting that through the city council if the alderman is opposed. Erin, to what extent is this like a compromise, or do you think that it seems more like this was sort of what Riley had in mind in the first place?
Yeah, because Riley kind of made I don't know if it was this exact suggestion or something very similar last month, this kind of process. But yeah, I don't know, kind of to the last point on this slide, do businesses really care who signs off? Like, to the point that it expedites this, I don't know.
Yeah, so a reason I added on there in part because our most recent episode of our podcast, the Clubcast, which everyone should download and listen to right now, was with a gentleman named Sam Toya, who some people may be familiar with, who's the head of the Illinois Restaurant Association. And I asked him about this whole thing, and he really went out of his way to say, we don't care if it's the alderman, we don't care if it's Rosa Escareno, we just want these things done in 30 days instead of 90 or 120 days so that we can get our stores open. And that's it. So we're going to move on, but first, I want to encourage everyone to, again, ask any questions or write any comments. We have one question on public way use, or a comment on public way use permits from Justin, saying that one of the things that has been lost in the public way use conversation is how many of them go wrong or get lost in the system. I don't know if this will be addressed or solved into the new rules, but it's certainly relevant. Yeah, I mean, a big question from this is just, is it a positive technocratic move for the sake of just streamlining things and making them work better if the department handles it or the aldermen do? I think that a lot of people in city government will say, well, we're the career professionals, we know how to do these things more efficiently. But we heard, Brendan Riley say, I don't know if we trust Joe the bureaucrat, which is a term that he likes to use, to make these decisions when we're the ones who really know our ward. So that's the sort of constant push and pull. Let's move on and talk about Bronzeville Lakefront, formerly known as Burnham Lakefront, formerly known as the Michael Reese Hospital, formerly known as the future Olympic Village for the 2016 Games. So Heather, can you bring us a little bit up to date on, or bring us back on the history of this piece of property? How did it get from a hospital to potentially the site of a new neighborhood?
So back in 2008, Michael Reese closed as a hospital. And then in 2009, the buildings were torn down. And that same year was really the height of former Mayor Richard M. Daley's attempt to win the 2016 games that ultimately ended up going to Rio. And part of the city's pitch to the International Olympic Committee was that the Olympic Village would be built along Chicago's lakefront on this 50 acres, which if you're standing on the roof of McCormick Place is just south of you. And of course, Chicago didn't even make it past the first round of voting for the 2016 Olympics, and the property's been vacant ever since, costing the city, millions of dollars in interest payments on top of the purchase price of $91 million, as well as sort of maintenance and upkeep. So under former Mayor Rahm Emanuel, the city launched sort of a request for proposals to say, hey, development firms, come tell us what you think we should do with this land. And really it had all of the proposals just really ran the gamut. But the proposal that ultimately won out was the one that was approved yesterday from Grit and Farpoint developers, which is to basically build a whole new neighborhood. It's going to have 4,800 homes. It's going to have like a hospital and life sciences, campus research facility, offices and shops. And it is really designed to sort of turn that really vacant no man's land into sort of the economic engine of the near south side. And it's not going to be cheap. It is a nearly $4 billion development, and it needs somewhere in the neighborhood of $90 million in help from the city. About $60 million of that will be to build roads across the property. So it was sort of just this one big vacant campus, and the city is going to get in there and build new roads. And it also needs about $30 million of environmental cleanup because a century ago, this property was a factory where radium was created, and it has left hazardous waste behind. So the city's on the hook to clean that up as well. But this is really sort of a stunning end to this chapter in Chicago history, which was almost derailed, people forget, by Mayor Lori Lightfoot after the state approved a casino for Chicago. She suggested building a casino on this property at a time when this proposal was very much sort of moving through the process of development and sort of a community-driven process and sort of meeting with neighbors and whatnot. And that drew sort of an immediate pushback from Alderman Sophia King, who said, we don't want a casino here. We have plans for it. And it was, I think, really a low point between the relations between Sophia King and Lori Lightfoot. But as you can see, no casino in sight here. And wherever Chicago's casino will be, it won't be built here.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about the casino, or I guess the community engagement and how that ended up in a second. But just piggybacking off what you were saying about I get to use this cool laser pointer function. Can you guys see that? I just noticed that. So it was this big mess of like dead end streets. They're going to through this infrastructure agreement, they're going to do this connective. This is, I guess, Vernon and then Cottage, if I have those right, make like a connective thing. If you ever hear Scott Goodman, who's the head of Farpoint, the like main developer in Grit, talk about it, he envisions this really futuristic sort of life science village. He talks about self-driving cars, and it's going to be anchored by this ARC Innovation Center, what they call it. It's this giant lab here at the South, run by Sheba Medical Group, this Israeli-based biotech company. It's going to have a big welcome center at the bottom. You may notice this whole part that's sort of faded out on the side. This is the McCormick Place marshalling yards that was not included in any of the agreements that were approved yesterday, but has been sort of left open-ended as another, potential phase 2 or 3 down the line. So yesterday we saw 3 different approvals tied to this go forward. One was just the straight zoning to allow it to move forward. One was the public infrastructure, and then one was the sale of this city-owned property to the development team. And tied to that sale was a redevelopment agreement that holds the developer to some commitments to the city, some public benefits. Erin, could you walk us through what some of those public benefits were, what the redevelopment agreement encompassed, and why that was so crucial for this?
Yeah, so one of the things, kind of, as Heather mentioned, is the reconfiguring of the streets. So it's not just a massive plot of land with haphazard roadways. There's also a public park that's going to be built. I think it's off of 31st Street.
Down here.
And there's also a commitment to affordable housing, obviously, in the development.
The residential element.
Yes. And Aldermen were pretty complimentary of Alderman Sophia King's ability to get, these public improvements kind of hashed out. And I think that might have been what was holding up some of the moving the development forward in the past month or past couple of weeks.
Yeah, Heather?
I was just going to say that I think part of what held it up and made it more complicated was Alderman Sophia King's sort of insistence and pressure on the developer that all of the affordable units be built on site. So under city rules, this development was required to set aside about 1,000 units for low and moderate income Chicagoans. And there's a couple of ways that developers can fulfill that requirement. One, they can build the units on site. That is usually the most expensive option. 2, they can pay a fee to the city, which the city can then take that money and use to build low income housing. Or 3, they can build a certain number of units on site and they can build a certain number of units off site. But all of the affordable housing units will be built built on site as part of this development. And I think that is relatively unusual for a development of this size and complexity. And I think that that was one of the reasons why it did not run into really any bumps at the city council, because that is a frequent sort of source of complaints from progressive aldermen. But this development had sort of already resolved that. And I think it will be seen as a test case that aldermen will hold up and sort of, show to other developers, and they say, look, if this Bronzeville lakefront development could do all affordable on site, so can you. And I think it has the potential to sort of set a new standard for those sort of developments.
Right. So the city rules you mentioned, it has to have at least or account for some kind of obligation equal to 20% of all the units on site. That is because this is being conveyed from city-owned land. And, it's interesting you bring up how smooth this was. I remember a little more than 2 years ago, we had two other mega developments, Lincoln Yards and the 78, going in. They were not as smooth. They were not unanimous votes. There was a lot of acrimony and angst around them. I feel like there are a couple reasons, some of which you've already brought up, and some of which I'm thinking about for why this was so different. But, the housing being one of them, why else, Heather, was this so different in terms of the way it was received and how smooth the vote was?
So I think it can be summarized in three small letters: TIF, TIF. So I mentioned before that the development is going to get about $60 million in city money to build the roads. That money is coming from the infrastructure plan approved as part of the 2021 budget back in the fall. The remaining $30 million for the environmental cleanup may come from the area's tax increment financing district, but that hasn't sort of been completely worked out yet. But the fact that this development did not ask for the level of subsidy that both Lincoln Yards and the 78 did meant that it was much easier for progressive aldermen to vote for it. It just sort of sucked all of the oxygen out of the air, because if you're talking about a $4 billion development in return for a $90 million investment from the city, that math is a lot easier for aldermen to stomach than when you have sort of literally almost $2 billion in subsidies together for Lincoln Yards and the 78. And especially because this development is located on the south side, I think it was seen as something that a lot of aldermen wanted to support, to show that developers should consider the south side. So there was also an incentive for them to sort of work it behind the scenes and to not sort of create a public spectacle the way that Lincoln Yards and the 78 did. I also think it helps that we talked a little bit about how Sophia King ran this process. She had months and months of community meetings that really served to neutralize any sort of opposition from adjacent landowners or neighbors. Block Club Chicago did some reporting about how there was some concern about how the hiring would be handled in terms of the future uses of the site, that life sciences campuses, but they reached agreements to sort of direct those jobs to Southside residents. Also, the development firms were enthusiastic about meeting the city's requirement to subcontract at least 30% of the work to firms owned by Black and Latino Chicagoans. So the city's rules say at least 26% have to go to Black and Latino-owned firms. Another 6% has to go to female-owned firms. And the development consortium said, look, we're going to try for 65%. And if they hit 65%, we are all going to be deluged in the number of press releases that they will send out about it, because that would be just a massive, massive accomplishment that really no other large-scale development has been able to achieve. So we'll be watching that. But the fact of that commitment also sort of meant that that was not something that aldermen could argue about or wanted to argue about or had to sort of put pressure on the developer to come to the table on. So but this is the anti-Lincoln Yards. There were no marches, there were no press conferences, there was very little controversy about that, and I think that is a credit to Alderman Sophia King, who has really sketched a fascinating sort of path through City Hall after being appointed by Rahm Emanuel, and want to win re-election, and then to join the Progressive Caucus, and now to lead the Progressive Caucus. That is not the typical path for aldermen, and it's really fascinating.
Right. And one last little interesting subplot to all of this. We talked about how this is the anti-Lincoln Yards. Scott Goodman, who I mentioned, who's the sort of head of this entire development team, he in 1988 was actually the founder of a development firm called Sterling Bay. And he left Sterling Bay in 2016, right before all the Lincoln Yard stuff was getting set up, and sort of broke away and founded his own firm called Farpoint. And since then, in some of the original planning of this, took some kind of subtle digs at Lincoln Yards. He was saying things like, well, we don't want to build skylines, we want to build neighborhoods. He said they want to avoid the acrimony that surrounded Lincoln Yards. And so this was, this is sort of his victory lap, and a way of, actually making a real direct, rebuttal to Lincoln Yards. So we'll have to see what happens next. So moving on to the latest other scuffle over aldermanic prerogative, the Inspector General Joseph Ferguson, who now we know his days are numbered, he's going to not retire, his office pointed out, but step down in October. Just to do a little bit of background on this, under the Shackman decree, Shackman lawsuit, it was basically regulated through the federal court system that almost all city employees have to go through this very rigid, regimented sort of hiring process in order to prevent people from hiring their political allies. This was done, put into practice over the course of years after the hired truck scandal. But ward superintendents were left out of that process. These are the people who are, report to the Department of Streets and Sanitation, but also are picked by aldermen who oversee all of the day-to-day, block by block, trash pickup, garbage, street sweeping, things like that. So the Heather, could you just quickly walk us through what the report was from Joe Ferguson, what that stipulated, and sort of how aldermen are responding to that?
So essentially, a ward superintendent is the head guy, our girl, in charge of all of the nitty-gritty work of local government. Do you need a pothole filled? You call this guy or girl. Do you have an alley that's full of trash because somebody moved out and created a mess? This is who you call. Has there been a massive snowstorm and are people snowed in and our alleys blocked and our streets impassable? This is the call that you make. So just like with business signs, aldermen know that they are going to be held responsible for this sort of quality of life on election day. And this position, ward superintendent, is somewhat weirdly situated in the city's hiring code. It exists under the Department of Streets and Sanitation and reports to the Commissioner of Streets and Sand, but works closely with each of the 50 aldermen. So essentially, Ferguson's audit found that violates the Shackman decree, that essentially aldermen should not be allowed to pick whomever they want to work in this position, because this position reports to the Streets and Sand Commissioner and should be hired like any other position in Streets and Sand. Now, his recommendation was that they come up with sort of new hiring regulations that would give aldermen a say in who gets this job, but not the final decision. And that seems to be a non-starter, both with members of the city council and, surprisingly, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, because back in the days of the daily machine, the alderman's greatest power was the ability to sort of dole out jobs like this one, which is well paid. Senior ward superintendents can make up to $120,000 a year, to dole out these sort of positions to political supporters. And that, of course, is no longer allowed by the courts. So he said, we got to work something out so that we don't run afoul of this degree. And it sounds like Mayor Lightfoot disagrees with him, which undermines her case to end aldermanic prerogative, because this would really formalize and increase aldermanic power to have hiring and firing authority over this position. And I gotta say, I was a little bit surprised about that, because Ferguson here was giving the mayor a way to say, nope, we got to scale back this power. We got to do this by the book. We've got to follow good government rules. And there's no greater good government name in Chicago politics than Michael Shackman. And now it sounds like the mayor will endorse a city ordinance that would basically say, nope, despite this court decree, aldermen are going to have the power to hire and fire this, which of course could trigger a court fight, which could cost the city money and would potentially sort of, serve to, decrease aldermanic power, because once you get the courts involved, you can never really you can never really predict where they're going to end up. So it's a really interesting indication, and another indication that despite being longtime professional acquaintances and friends, Joe Ferguson and Lori Lightfoot are on very, very different wavelengths at City Hall in these last months of his 12 years in office.
Yeah, I called up Michael Shackman last week when this came out and asked him his thoughts about this, and he said, finally, back in 2007, when Shackman was negotiating terms with the city to move into this, oversight, this federal monitor, Shackman said he explicitly wanted superintendents to fall under these Shackman rules, and because Shackman exemption is only allowed for positions that involve sensitive political decision-making or policy decision-making. And he said, what kind of policy decision-making is inherent in, directing the logistics of street sweeping? None. And he eventually folded on that in return for a higher settlement payment from the city. And so Hopkins just went in and said, okay, well, then we'll fix that. We'll add the word policy to aldermen's literal job descriptions. And like you said, Heather, in his report, Ferguson actually said the administration is behind this. The administration is already moving to change this process. The mayor undermined that and went back and said, not so fast. Erin, what was Lightfoot saying about this, about the streets and sand operations, the importance of this position, and sort of how is she justifying coming down where she did?
She didn't, I don't know that she took necessarily a specific position yesterday when asked about it after the press conference, but I think, I don't recall, but I thought I remember her saying something about, aldermen know best about their wards, which is the exact argument that you hear aldermen making all the time, that we know best, we know the alleys, we know the streets, etc. So yeah, that was interesting to me compared to what was in the report, that it contradicted what the report said, that her office was already moving to make this change.
Yeah, it seems now like we have two of these issues coming up yesterday between sign permits and ward superintendent hiring, where the mayor sort of stepped back from her firebrand platform issue, trying to remove aldermen from these points of decision making and saying, the aldermen are the ones who are dealing with this every day. They know the streets, they know their constituents. And so we'll see if this is a sign of things to come, or if she was just trying to momentarily, make nice to get this legislation through. Whole big roundup of other legislation introduced. We're probably not going to get too extensive on all of this, but if you want a more thorough recounting of everything that was introduced, you should subscribe to the Daily Line if you haven't. If you are a member already, you can see our massive comprehensive roundup of all legislation that was introduced. One thing that, let's see, what should we go through here? Walter Burnett introduced a ordinance to legalize sports betting. This is something the door had been open to under the new state law a couple of years ago. And he said, the United Center is in my ward. I want to give back. They've been doing great work through the pandemic. And the ordinance would let the sports venues, 5 of them, see if I remember them off the top of my head, United Center, Wrigley Field, Guaranteed Rate, Wintrust Arena, I don't remember the 5th one, that would be able to actually accept the concessions and charges for the sports wagering, and then they would also have to apply for licenses. This was sent to Rules Committee by Anthony Beal, who made, Erin, do you remember, was it a process argument, or what was his reasoning for sending this to the Rules Committee yesterday?
Yeah, so at first he said that this proposal was submitted by Alderman Walter Burnett late, that it was submitted after, I think it's the 10 a.m. Monday deadline that City Clerk Ana Valencia had set in place for when you have to submit an ordinance to be introduced at City Council. Yeah, and then I think Ana Valencia said, or Clerk Valencia said,
yeah, it's like not a hard and fast rule. It's just a policy guideline.
Yeah, it's not actually in the code. And so Alderman Beal gave up that argument and just called an alternate committee and sent it to Rules, which he could have done in the first place, but it was apparent he wanted to make this known that this ordinance was submitted after the kind of deadline of 10 a.m. Monday.
Yeah, so this was actually one of only 2 new ordinances that was sent to Rules yesterday, which I would say is pretty low for what we've seen recently. Certainly lower than the 25 that we saw sent to Rules Committee 2 months ago. But I talked to Burnett after this, and he said, I asked him about it being sent to Rules, and he said, well, the casino industry is trying to block it because they want all that revenue going to their own casinos. And I tried to ask him a little bit more and say, well, do you think that's why Beal sent it to Rules? And he said, I don't know, I can't say, but he said the casinos have their lobbyists running around. I also thought of that when the mayor was asked about this in her press conference yesterday, and she sort of gave a little wink and was like, well, you can ferret out what really happened there. Again, we don't know exactly, but that's what we have from her and have from Burnett. Heather, looking at this list that we have here, are there any that jumped out to you that you are going to be watching very closely or that you want to take a second to talk about?
So I think that the changing in the way that the city allows the legal sale of cannabis is going to be another big fight. It would sort of loosen restrictions and really sort of change the way that cannabis has been sold in Chicago since it was legalized for a year and a half ago now. I think we're going to see arguments about allowing it to be sold downtown, which is something that Alderman Brendan Riley favors and which Mayor Lightfoot dismissed several months ago, saying that she didn't want to turn the Magnificent Mile into a pot paradise. Which
instant catchphrase.
Yes, an amazing alliteration. So we're going to see a big fight about that because there are very serious and systematic concerns that the people who were most impacted by the war on drugs, Black and Latino Chicagoans, have really yet to benefit from the legalization in any sort of serious way. So that's going to be a big fight. There was a lot of news coverage about Alderman Anthony Napolitano's attempt to crack down on quality of life crimes like vandalism by giving the city's law department the authority to sort of take those people to court through an administrative citation process that also got sent to Rules. The city law department does not have the staff to do that. I think it would raise significant questions about whether it would lead to continued over-policing of Black and brown Chicagoans who live in neighborhoods where there is more vandalism, where there is more graffiti, where there is more sort of crime that does not rise to the level of misdemeanor or felony charges from the police department. So I would be surprised if we see that emerge from the legislative limbo of the Rules Committee. I think there is going to be a continued push as we start talking about the budget and the federal relief funds. The city hasn't decided how to spend, about what percentage of those funds should be used to house Chicagoans who don't have somewhere to live. And of course, the eviction moratorium is about to start ending. It will end completely on August 31st. So we will have a better sense as we begin those discussions about whether there was a tsunami of evictions, as so many people fear that there will be.
Yeah, and real quick on the cannabis proposal, because this is really big and I think going to be a continued source of conversation. And by the way, while I'm doing this, last chance to add in any questions at the top there, so that we can make sure that we have some time to get to those. This would have 3 provisions. I think the most minor would be that it would sort of like shave down the boundaries of that downtown exclusion zone. It would go to Oak Street instead of Division, and then sort of Rush instead of State. It would still leave Michigan Avenue, which is the big prize in the exclusion zone. But on top of that, it would completely get rid of 2 key sort of controls that were put into the city's original zoning ordinances in 2019. First, it would get rid of the 7-district system that was designed to spread dispensaries evenly across the city, and there was a lottery. No more districts, no more lottery. Secondly, it would allow dispensaries to open in more commercial zones, specifically B3 and C1 zones, that was specifically added by aldermen, specifically by the Aldermanic Black Caucus, into the original zoning policy so that they would be able to control zoning changes and have more levers to be able to do that. Those are both gone. I asked the mayor about that yesterday to sort of defend those 2 specific provisions, and she declined. She just sort of said, well, this is a starting point. We'll talk more about it. So she sort of softened. In the couple of minutes we have wrapped up here, I'm still not seeing any questions, but it's not too late. A lot of stuff going to be on our minds during this August recess as we look to the fall. Erin, what are you going to be watching the most closely?
2 things. Well, immediately next week, now that civilian oversight is passed and out of the Public Safety Committee, perhaps they can move on to more things. And I talked to Alderman Chris Taliaferro, who chairs the committee, and there's a meeting scheduled for next week in the committee, and they will take up, I don't know that there will be a vote on, but they will discuss the proposed Anjanette Young ordinance and the gang database. So now that we've moved on from one massive topic, we can tackle more, though. Obviously, civilian oversight was much larger than those 2. And ward remapping will begin soon, or possibly, I guess.
Next week?
Well,
Monday.
Yeah, right. So I'm going to be interested to know, how often aldermen are meeting, who's in the room, how maps are getting drawn. There's been this huge, call for the community to be more involved. Will the I don't know, grassroots kind of community group, will they just continue on their own track while aldermen are drawing their own wards in a map room somewhere?
This independent ward remapping commission, I think the big question is going to be, this is the one that's led by Change Illinois and some reform groups, this citizen advisory board that's holding all kinds of meetings. I think the question is going to be, will they have any power? Will they have any influence? Or will it be more like the state process where they were sort of, waving their hands and yelling through the whole process and trying to get people to listen to them, and then the Democratic legislators in charge just went ahead and did what they were going to do. All right, before we wrap up, because we want to make it an hour exactly, Heather, what else are you going to be watching as we move throughout into the fall?
Well, I think that we are quickly approaching election season. There's going to be a lot of attention, of course, on the statewide races with the governor and the Secretary of State's race sort of leading the ticket. But I think we're going to see an attempt by the Illinois GOP to sort of chart a post-Trump, or at least an interim Trump strategy in Illinois, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out. I missed it last month, but the mayor's political team set up a new Twitter handle at @team_Lightfoot, indicating that she certainly is laying the groundwork to run for 2023. And we will start seeing people after Labor Day begin to start putting plans in the work to launch runs for the aldermen. So there is literally no rest for the weary, even though we don't know what the boundaries of these wards will look like for the 2023 election, but that will not stop aldermen.
Right, 2023, only 2 years away, but also right around the corner. Okay, I want to thank everyone so much for tuning in. If you could, we will have a recording of this posted on YouTube. Thank you, Erin. Thank you so much to Heather Cherone of WTTW. And also one last pitch, if you have not checked out the second quarter results of the Chicago Index survey that went out today, that is live today. We have a story about it. And yeah, please subscribe, become a member, follow us on Twitter. Or just our names on Twitter. Erin has an underscore in hers. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next month or in
Thanks
September.
for having me.